So this is my short video lecture on Peter the Great of Russia, where our topic in Unit 3 is absolutism and the increased role of the sovereign or the monarch in national interests, the nation states. Okay? So here we're talking about Peter the Great. Now, let's start off, just note from the get-go the differences between Peter's grandfather's predecessor, Mikhail Romanov, and the left, and then on the right, my picture of a young Peter on the throne. And notice that Peter, in his appearance, more closely resembles the beardless and stylish Europeans of the 17th century than the rough and rather tunic-garbed Michael on the left. Now keep in mind, though, that both of these men were separated by only about 50 years. And so you can see the tremendous respect, or I should say the esteem with which Peter the Great viewed Western European styles. That is one of the essential things in understanding Peter the Great, is that you must appreciate Peter's desire to make Russia more like the great nation states of Western Europe, even insofar as the appearance. So we'll continue now and look at our next slide. The reason for Peter's appearance and style of dress is a good place to start when talking about absolutism in Russia of the 16 and 1700s, okay, the 17th and 18th centuries. Peter was determined to westernize his country. And by that we mean to make it great. He felt that Russia needed to be on the same level as the great nation states of Western Europe. But that meant modernizing Russia. And one of his goals was to increase literacy in Russia through a reform of education. Because in the late 17th century, Russia had a tremendously low literacy rate, especially among its peasant population. So on the bottom right-hand side, I have one of my favorite quotes from Peter the Great, and I think this sums up his attempts, his approach to education for Russia. He said, "For learning is good and fundamental, and as it were the root, the seed, and first principle of all that is good and useful in church and state." And when I look at this quote, when I read it, I just can't help but to see in it Peter's desire to build up Russia from the ground up, so to speak, to have a literate, educated population, and thereby to guarantee the success of Russia in that reform of education. Peter also incorporated Western European styles of dress and architecture into Russia. He ordered all the Russian noblemen to shave their long beards. So just like Peter, who did not have a beard, he ordered all of the Russian noblemen to shave their beards. And now you must understand that having a long beard in Russia was a sign of wisdom. Okay, a beard was associated with wisdom, with kind of the revered age, so to speak. And so the nobles did not want to cut their beards off, the noblemen, but Peter ordered them to shave their long beards so as to appear more like the West, to appear more like the Western European men. He also ordered the nobility to cut the traditionally long sleeves of their robes, okay? So the Russian nobility wore these beautiful, woven, silken robes. But if you notice the picture on the left, the sleeves on these robes were exaggeratedly long. I mean, the sleeves deliberately extended over the hands. And this was so that the nobles could kind of flaunt their wealth. You know, the sleeve length was exaggerated in order to show that the noblemen could not even do his own work. He had to have a servant do everything, for him or her. So the sleeves were exaggerated in that sense. Okay. Well, Peter ordered them to cut the sleeves of the robes, so as not to appear so long and useless. If a sleeve is covering your hand, you obviously can't use your hand, so someone has to do everything for you, right? Well, that was the whole notion behind the nobility having the long sleeves, is that they wanted to demonstrate how noble they were by the fact that they didn't have to do anything for themselves. They had servants to, make their tea and clean their home and serve them dinner and such. And so that was just one of those things. Peter also moved his capital from the traditional city of Moscow to a new location in the northwest of Russia, and he called it St. Petersburg. Now, the city was created from a drained swamp area, and it was built up into a grand city that rivaled the great cities such as Vienna and Prague and Paris and Berlin, Krakow, Budapest. At Peter's Winter Palace, the photograph on the lower right-hand side is of Peter's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and you can see that it was built in the French Baroque style of Versailles. Peter encouraged Western European styles of fashion as well. French was the language of choice spoken among the Russian nobility and upper classes. And Peter also invited many of the great intellectual minds of the West to come and teach at the various universities in Russia. And let's continue. Peter traveled to Holland, in the Netherlands, in order to learn shipbuilding techniques, with the hope of thereby building up the Imperial Russian Navy into a great power, one that would rival the great navies of England and France and the Netherlands herself. Okay? And so Peter toured the great port city of Haarlem in North Holland. And he spent a considerable amount of time there. In fact, I had a chance to visit Haarlem 2 years ago and to visit the port that Peter stayed at, where he learned all of the great shipbuilding techniques from the Dutch, with the hope in order to return to Russia with the plans, basically the architectural the structural plans of the great Dutch ships, and thereby build up the Russian Navy. Now, having a navy is just one thing. If you have a navy, you need a access to the water. Now, Russia does have vast access to the oceans, but many of the problems are that many of the Russian ports freeze over in the winter. And if you just think about the geography of Russia, and much of it is above the Arctic Circle, and therefore much of throughout the Russian winter, the Russian ports freeze over, and making them unusable. So Peter staged quite a few wars to the south of Russia against the Turks in order to and the Ottoman Turks, in order to gain access to the Black Sea and therefore the Mediterranean. So part of his strategy was to build up the Russian Navy by increasing Russia's access to what they call the cold weather ports that could still be used even in the winter. Okay, let's go on to our next slide. So here is one thing about Peter, is that Peter could be very ruthless when he had to. Note Peter's personally executing many of the elite guards who were involved in the Streltsy revolt against him. He also had his own son Alexei imprisoned when the young man was implicated in a plot against Peter. So Peter's very own son, Alexei, was implicated in a plot against Peter, And Peter, therefore, had Alexei not only imprisoned, but many believe that Peter also had Alexei murdered. Okay, so Peter could be very ruthless when necessary. Peter used what was called the table of ranks as a way of keeping the nobility in check. Now, the table of ranks was a publication, a listing, a proclamation. Think of it as a proclamation that was issued by Peter and therefore established the different levels of nobility in Russia and who was what. In other words, like a baron or an earl or a duke, that kind of thing. And so Peter established the table of ranks as an effort of keeping the nobility constantly wondering what level they were at based on Peter's personal desire and whim, right? Peter also limited the power of the Russian Orthodox Church while at the same time keeping it as a powerful ally. Peter knew that the faith of the Russian peasants was very strong, but he also knew that the Orthodox Church held great amounts of land and wealth. And the church refused to modernize. Now, if there was one group in Russia that refused to go along with Peter's plan of becoming more like the West, it was the Russian Orthodox Church. And so Peter did a number of things to place the Russian Orthodox Church under the government or his own control. And one of them was the establishment of what he called the Holy Synod, which was essentially a pro-Peter government body that would oversee the Russian Orthodox Church. For instance, the paying the monks and the bishops and the clergy and such, maintaining the Russian churches themselves, the buildings and such. And so, with the establishment of the Holy City, Peter effectively made the Russian Orthodox Church a government office, and therefore it would be under Peter's direct control. I couldn't resist putting a picture of Vladimir Putin because one of Putin's nicknames is the new Tsar, and Putin is one of the Russian presidents who is very good at using the Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, that's been one of the hallmarks of his term is the use of the Russian Orthodox Church to make himself look good in the eyes of the Russian people. So lately people have been calling Putin the new Tsar. By the way, that word Tsar, there are two ways to spell it. You can spell it C-Z-A-R, or you can spell it T-S-A-R. Okay, so there are two ways to spell it. Yeah, sometimes you'll see it spelled C-Z-A-R. Sometimes I usually spell it T-S-A-R. Both are the same. And both words. The word Tsar comes from the Latin Caesar, and the Tsar is the Russian form of that word, and it means king. It means, now, in Peter's case, Peter was not only Tsar, but he was emperor as well. Okay, but the word comes from the Latin root Caesar. Let's go to our last slide. And I think this bronze statue that was commissioned by Peter's granddaughter, Catherine the Great, or Katerina the Great, okay, demonstrates that spirit of Peter that we see in his absolutist reign. Here he's seen astride a magnificent horse. He's rearing up, and he's looking far off into the future. So this statue was commissioned by Catherine, his granddaughter, in order to portray him as he was seen and understood by the Russian people, and that is a kind of a visionary leader for Russia and one of its greatest czars. In fact, the Romanov family would go on to rule Russia up until the Russian Revolution in 1917. So for 300 years, the Romanov family ruled Russia.